gasoline prices have increased by nearly 29% year over year. That is the latest findings from the inflation numbers that were released today, May 12th, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics for April of 2026. And as an economist, I want to walk you through the numbers and talk about what this means for the average worker, because what we see from this report is that the increase in fuel and energy prices from gasoline, from fuel oil, from electricity, that is the main driver that we are seeing for inflation, which in April of 2026 hit a year-to-year rate of about 3.8%. This means that consumer prices in the United States rose by the fastest rate since May of 2023, and this is fueled mostly by the rising fuel and energy prices we have seen due to the closure in the Strait of Hormuz. What we see from the numbers is that gasoline prices, as I mentioned, increased by almost 29%, fuel oil increased by almost 55%, and electricity prices increased by over 6%. Now, we know from economic data that the people who are most affected by the rising price of gasoline are lower income Americans, which you might be saying, Sarah, no duh, like that makes total sense. But when we look at actual consumption data, higher income Americans in March of 2026 did not change their fuel consumption at all in response to higher prices. But we see that lower income Americans are cutting back on their consumption of gasoline, either by driving less or potentially carpooling or using public transportation. What else does the report show? Well, we find that food prices in the month of April increased by 0.5%. And this was true across most categories of food. Think dairy and eggs, think fruits and vegetables, think beef. And this is all before baking in the costs of the rising cost of fertilizer due to the closures happening in the Strait of Hormuz. And if we choose to net out the food and energy prices, which tend to be more volatile measures of inflation, we still find that inflation is increasing by about 2.8% year over year, which is higher than the Federal Reserve's target rate of about 2%. Now, the major concern we have as economists about this is that there does not seem to be a resolution to these higher prices coming anytime soon. There have been multiple continued breakdowns in the resolution of opening the Strait of Hormuz and allowing for that supply shock in oil to resolve itself. We are also not seeing any effort to repeal or remove the tariffs that were instituted last year, which I know we've largely forgot about, but they are still major drivers of increases in prices. In fact, it was reported today that the steel and aluminum tariffs that were placed on by the current administration last year are actually driving up the cost of canned food because the price of producing cans is now more expensive. And this lack of seeing any sort of potential solution to our inflation problems is motivating economists to project that by the summer, we might see inflation numbers of about 4.5% year over year. Now, as we've talked about before, another major concern is how do these inflation numbers match up with how much wages are increasing, right? How are Americans' purchasing power affected by the rising price of fuel, food, and other goods? Last month, it was reported that average real weekly wages increased by about 3.6% year over year. So if we compare that 3.6% rate to the increase in CPI by about 3.8%, it means that inflation is rising faster than wages, which means people's purchasing power, right? The amount they are able to buy with the wages they have is decreasing, which means the cost of living for people is getting to be more and more unaffordable. And the economic data now shows that. And again, the concern with that is that if people feel like they can't afford their current cost of living, they will cut back on spending. They will cut back on investing, which means we might experience something known as the wage price spiral, where we might find ourselves in a recession. Now, a lot of politicians and people who have more conservative viewpoints on the economy are saying that they are not alarmed by this rising increase of inflation. In fact, Kevin Warsh, who is the incoming Federal Reserve Chair, has urged economists to look at some alternative measures of inflation, including something known as the trimmed means measure, which strips out the categories that are the most volatile in every month. Think of things like food and energy. We will get that measurement today from the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland, but preliminary measurements from some private industry research groups have found that that trimmed means measure is expected to rise by 0.44% in the month of April, which is faster than the core CPI rate I mentioned earlier. So this economic inflation report, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, does not look encouraging for the future of prices and affordability in the United States. So for now, that's all I got, unfortunately. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know.